I just want to begin by focusing our attention on the wider social and political context, and that changing context in particular. You may have come across this survey by Chatham House about a week ago, I think it was, where they surveyed around 10,000 people from 10 European countries, and they looked at the issue of where do the public in these European countries stand on the specific issue of Muslim immigration. And this survey was done before Trump's executive order, and what they found, actually, which they said was quite startling and stark, was that the evidence suggested that both Trump and the radical right-wing parties in these European countries reflect an underlying reservoir of public support, and that across all of those 10 European countries, an average of 55% agreed that all further migration from Muslim countries should be stopped, and 20% disagreed with that. Pew did some research last year. Of course, Pew monitor global trends and attitudes. Again, looking at the unfavourable attitudes towards Muslims, but also the Roma community as well in many of these 10 countries. And what's interesting is that they documented that in the past year, unfavourable opinions of Muslims has increased in the UK by about 9 percentage points. It's not a great trend that we're seeing. But the biggest divide in each country, however, tends to be political. So if you look at the second chart there, those on the ideological right tend to have more negative views towards Muslims, but what I found particularly interesting were those on the political centre, and how many of the European countries there also held quite deeply unfavourable attitudes around Muslims as well. We need to question and critique whether the impact of our activism is actually helping to contribute, or is it making the situation better or not? And this is a very critical juncture because of the political climate of our times today. We know that the traditional days of left and right are now slowly being replaced with what are often termed open and closed societies, and we see this in the US and across Europe, where the greatest momentum are often those whose rhetoric is often populist, nationalist, anti-diversity and anti-establishment. So whether Trump in the US, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France, what many politicians are doing in this particular climate is cynically pandering to voters by engaging in the politics of fear, the politics of us versus them. And we also find ourselves in this time in a post-truth society where facts are indeed the opinions of experts no longer matter. And so this politics of fear in a post-truth society helps to contribute towards the formation of closed societies. And it's not surprising that The Economist, after the EU referendum at the brink of the US elections, argued that this risk of having closed societies is the gravest risk to the free world, and nothing matters more than countering it. And so we know right now that there's never been a better time for the rise and appeal of politicians who advocate for the closed society. And the fact that the world has shifted rapidly in the last few decades, the neat and clear demarcating lines between left and right, east and west, the local and the global are now blurred. And the world is in a constant state of flux, presenting unprecedented challenges, which undoubtedly bring uncertainty, insecurity, and anxiety. And of course, with the rise of Islamist terror groups like ISIS, coordinating attacks, encouraging homegrown Muslims, European citizens to carry out those brutal attacks, they all help to play on the anxieties and fears that have on the other. So as a result, rather than left and right, the new political fault lines centre around immigration, identity politics, security, the impact of globalisation on local communities, and of course, Islam itself. So what does this mean? Well, the middle ground, in fact, is under threat, as is the political centre ground too. And the centre ground of politics is under threat, as is the wider middle ground, which I've put here as the shared values, compassionate coexistence, and our common humanity. We know that populist far-right groups very much promote this us versus them narrative, as do ISIS and Islamist extremists. ISIS talk about the grey zone, this middle ground that they seek to extinguish. But what's interesting to me in particular is there's a symbiotic circle. With the rise of both far-right and Islamist extremism, they help contribute and establish the closed societies by playing on those anxieties and fear. And closed societies further cement extreme views of the other. And that cycle we are seeing consistently. It's a cycle that we need to break. So defending human rights is critical in defeating extremism, but also preserving the notion of the open society. So what's interesting is that while this wider debate is taking place in many countries, this debate between open and closed society, what we also are witnessing is that Islam itself appears to be undergoing its own struggle between the idea of an open Islam and a closed Islam. So it's not just a battle between open and closed societies, but there's a mirror battle taking place within Islam between an open, inclusive and plural Islam and those Muslims who advocate for a closed Islam in particular. And features of a closed Islam include abhorrence to diversity in Islamic thought and practice of Muslims, which were once, of course, defining features of Islam historically, but how now this is becoming increasingly monolithic and intolerant. We're seeing the rise of takfir. I mean, I've been an activist for 20 years now, and the level of intolerance I'm seeing now is particularly disturbing, where Muslims are going around now calling other Muslims Islamophobes, which I call a form of Western takfir light, in effect. And often, we don't recognise that a closed society, often dominated by this intolerance and hate and ideas and so forth, help to feed the closed society as well by playing on those anxieties and fears. Now, often this struggle is often viewed through a very narrow prism of terrorism, and this is hardly unsurprising. We look at the fact that there are so many terror groups out there claiming to speak in the name of Islam, whether it's Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Ansar al-Din, Taliban, Houthi, Taliban, blah, 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 it goes on. We know that 24,000 Muslims at least from 86 countries travel to join ISIS and live in their territory. But the issue of terrorism is only one aspect of the issue of a closed Islam. There's a much more wider issue. And it's the conflict that's taking place between Muslims themselves about what are the values that Islam stands for in the 21st century. Can human rights, pluralism, democracy, secularism, diversity sit comfortably with Islamic ideals or not? What does Islam stand for in the 21st century? What are the values of this great faith today? I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. But who said Islam is not compatible with these values? This quote by Ibn al-Qayyim is a very powerful and very well-known quote about Sharia. And of course now, we see so much of Islamic orthodoxy today has been dominated by Wahhabi, literalist, Islamist ideologies and traditionalist, outdated fiqh. And you look at that definition of Sharia, and I don't think you're seeing an interpretation or a practice of that from what we're seeing today in the kind of contemporary discourse of Islam. So progressive Islamic ideals, unfortunately, remain on the fringe, despite the fact that Muslims in many countries across the world are struggling for them and sometimes dying for them daily. Yet progressive ideals were often a fundamental feature of Islamic theology and history, and so medieval Muslim scholars championed the idea of the rights of human, as did the Ottoman Empire. Of course, Muslim history is replete with freethinkers, scholars and philosophers who questioned accepted truths and challenged the dogmatic traditions of their time. And we've got many examples out there, and obviously very short of time, so just to give an example, Ibn Rushd, who talked about the reconciliation of secular philosophy and religious theology, arguing for freedom of thought and tolerance. And there existed a wide culture of free-thinking humanism, particularly between the 8th and 11th centuries during the Abbasid period. And what's so fascinating is how some philosophers would even criticise established religion, considering it to be harmful to the human intellect and humanity itself. I mean, imagine trying to say any of that today, and you'll find that the baggage of blasphemy laws falling on top of you now, despite the fact that within Islamic history, this criticism of religion itself was quite common. So, well, why does a British Islam matter? And let's be clear, it absolutely does. When I was a teenager, the notion of a British Islam was emerging. It was so exciting. It was a new time. And I think, for me, what I feel is in the last 10 to 15 years, my analysis is that somehow, the idea of a British Islam has kind of more or less lost momentum. And what we're seeing, actually, is instead a rise of a Salafi Islamist ideology, a very kind of modern ideology. It's a hybrid of the puritanical, literalist beliefs with the politicised Islamist ideology of the 20th century. When Salafism first appeared in the 19th century, their founders weren't necessarily anti-Western at all. But what we find today is that Salafism has been overtaken by a particularly puritanical and anti-Western strand, which is deeply concerning. There's also the issue about shared values. We're talking about shared values. Where are the red lines that, as Muslims, will say, this is where we can't cross? And in my mind, if you have Muslims, and you can find yourself anywhere on that spectrum, but if you advocate hate, violence, or discrimination against others, surely these need to be the red lines where we say, this is where we talk about defending our shared values. So understanding the difference between British Islam and Salafi Islamism, I think matters, and it matters for three reasons in particular. It matters because young Muslims today, who have little understanding of their own faith, believe this modern-day ideology is orthodox, or it claims to be orthodox, and it's that religious illiteracy which helps to make them vulnerable to ISIS propaganda, and they claim that represents religious legitimacy. I wrote a book called The Battle for British Islam, where I've highlighted actually how a lot of the young people that we interviewed, people who were drawn to ISIS propaganda, they genuinely believed that they needed to go to join ISIS territory, but that they could not be Western and Muslim. It was a complete, in their minds, it had to be a conflict of identity. So the idea of a British Islam counters that narrative. The other reason why it matters is because anti-Muslim bigots and far-right extremists believe all Muslims support Islamist extreme views, which undoubtedly fuels anti-Muslim hatred. So when Anjem Choudhury, as an Islamist extremist, starts burning poppies in the name of Islam, inevitably has a negative impact upon Islam and all ordinary Muslims. When his organisation in 2009 demonstrated against the armed forces during a homecoming parade in Luton, this led directly to the creation of the EDL, which wouldn't have happened had it not been for Anjem Choudhury and Islamist extremists giving all the rest of us a terrible name. So none of this helps in improving the attitudes that we are seeing in our country, or indeed in European countries as well. And the final reason why it matters, the difference between British Islam and Salafi Islamism in particular, is because some anti-racism campaigners on the left have ended up supporting and aligning themselves with Islamists in our country over and above human rights advocating Muslims. And this is of particular concern as we're seeing what's happening to the left and the crisis within the left, particularly the ultra-left, where traditionalist socialist ideology has, in effect, since the 1990s, been overtaken by identity politics. And often what we found is that some on the left have formed a de facto merger with Islamists in particular, and often attack Muslims who campaign for gender equality and human rights. And I think another really critical issue about one of the crises in the left is that the left's inability to champion patriotism has resulted in the far right, in particular, to carry the spanner. And as we see, it contributes to the closed society. So championing of British Islam, in my mind, helps to protect that very precious middle ground that we're seeking to preserve. And I think British Islam is going to have lots of different definitions and perceptions to lots of different people. For me, I believe it should be rooted in British values in the widest context of the term. I use that term, but it's also uniquely British in flavour. It's an Islam which, rather than rejecting the West, embraces it comfortably. It sees no conflict in being British and Muslim. But also the notion of a British Islam is one which has deep theological and historical backing. We know that historically Islam was often inextricably and deeply rooted in the culture of the country it resided in. We know many Muslim civilizations, despite following the same faith, embraced local culture and produced distinct social, cultural manifestations of Islam. So historically, diverse Muslim civilizations like the Mughals in India, or the Persians in Iran, the Moors in North Africa, the Arabs and many others, they differed in their expression of Islam, whether in their clothing, architecture, music, cuisine and language, yet they were all manifestly Islamic. So in China, Islam looked and felt Chinese. In Mali, it looked and felt African. In Britain and the West, Islam should look and feel British. And at the moment, there seems to be this very kind of puritanical strain that religion and culture cannot go hand in hand. That culture is seen as a polluting agent that has to be removed from religion. This is something that's not actually within the Islamic tradition or the Islamic heritage itself. And we also know that the notion of a British Islam, or championed by now deceased but very well respected theologians like Dr. Zaki Badawi, who died around 10, 11 years ago, he very much called for the idea of a British Islam, and it's one we need to continue to champion for. And it's interesting now because we're also seeing, that, particularly with the rise of ISIS, how many Muslim and contemporary theologians are responding to this and saying we need to defend the values like human rights. So there are great scholars like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayar, who's talked about that the values of equality, human rights, freedom and democracy are fully reconcilable with Islamic teachings. And he's advocated for neutral secularism rather than dreaming about an outdated concept of the caliphate. So, for example, he'll argue that neutral secularism are to be considered positive values such as respect for beliefs, neutrality or impartiality between different religions, recognition of individual and social human rights that the state protects, and so forth. And he has called upon Muslims and Muslim countries to build a human rights-based culture and to observe treaties like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think it's imperative that Muslims today invest in this and push forward in such an agenda. Just coming to an end now. There are so many ways that we need to think about, well, how do we push this idea of a British Islam? And I clearly don't have the time to talk about that today, but as an activist and campaigner, I want to talk about it from a civil society perspective and the importance of developing a multi-pronged civil society movement, that we need to invest and build an inclusive online and offline civil society-led movement for a British Islam which is against extremism, intolerance and the politics of hate, which must openly counter and challenge hate and those ideologies which advocate those very worrying qualities, and to champion human rights and equality causes. We need to be creatively promoting an alternative pluralistic counter-narrative in the idea of an open Islam to hate and regressive Islamist ideologies, and to get better at selling our brand and our vision for society. And we need to continue to cultivate the already positive trends within Muslim communities. Let's be very clear about it. Right now there are incredibly positive trends within Muslim communities where we're seeing young Muslims flourishing in all aspects of life, contributing to the arts, music and so many different ways. But there's also a very negative trend within British Muslim communities at the moment who are promoting regressive attitudes, and we need to challenge that. So just coming into an end now, just in terms of wider principles, I think it's very important that we stand up and we're very clear about the values that we stand for. We can't say that we're going to challenge Islamophobia or anti-Muslim prejudice, but refuse to challenge anti-Semitism. It doesn't work that way. It cannot happen that way. We've got to be very clear about the values that we stand for. But I do think strength is in numbers. The more people, as ordinary people, speak out, we challenge hate, we stand up for the values that we speak for, the more we help to normalise that discourse and that narrative. And it's very important, of course, that we all work together and support each other's arguments. And in this climate where anti-Muslim prejudice is clearly on the rise, I think it's really important, particularly for young people, that we say to them, yes, we must challenge it, but we must not allow it to shape or define us, because that's only going to push us into a hole. Rather, think about how can we contribute to British society in a positive way, particularly at this critical juncture. So yes, just to end really that, we need to reclaim our faith from those who've hijacked in promoting the hate and extremism, but we also need to define what Islam stands for today in the 21st century. Thank you.